Perfect, thank you. So welcome to the second of our series of webinars. This kind of, this brave new world that we're entering. This one is about character, and it's a very, to my mind, it's one of the key issues that we continue to face in the design world, and it's being raised in the context of the National Design Guide, but we're not. These sessions are to explore the issues covered in the National Design Guide rather than to act as training on the National Design Guide. So they are a bit different. So basically what I'm saying, participants, is that I expect you to go away and read it at some point. Let's see, how do I... this whole program is actually a collaboration between MHCLG, who are the custodians and publishers of the National Design Guide, and then we've got our design network partners. This one is co-sponsored by Creating Excellence, Design Midlands, and Creating Excellence. So they've got the Design Southwest Design Review Panel. We as a design network are the promoters of this. What was meant to be originally a series of training sessions has now turned into a series of webinars for obvious reasons. So you'll have to bear with us as the format changes. I'm actually confident that this is a better way of doing it anyway. I think discussions are more interesting than just sitting there having someone talk at you. Oh, welcome back, Joe. How are you doing?
Yes, I don't know where I went, but I'm back. Thank you.
Don't worry, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be right without some sort of IT disaster. So just quickly on this, we're at webinar 2 here. We've got 3 more after this. So please make sure you book into those as well. I think once we've completed the series, we're going to have covered a range of very interesting topics. And we're very lucky we get some very good speakers in on these. Not me, obviously, just the people we invite in. For those of you who haven't read it, which is of course none of you, this is the National Design Guide, launched in October, ostensibly by MHCLG, but there's a lot of input that has gone into this. It's different from design guides that you will have seen in the past. In the past, design guides were kind of how-to manuals about putting things together. This one is far more aimed at explaining the characteristics of a well-designed place. So it's organized into 3 overarching themes, which are climate, character, and community. And then within there are 10 characteristics of a well-designed place. The way the graphics are drawn within the National Design Guide try and get you around this problem of siloing, so that all the different design considerations are somebody else's problem. It's very much put graphically to try and hammer home the point that these things are interlinked, and that if you're doing one well, you're going to be impacting on all the others. These are the 10 characteristics: context, identity, built form, movement, nature, public spaces, uses, homes and buildings, resources, and lifespan. And there's that kind of roundel graphic there. Oh, hang on. Today we're going to be dealing with the character element, and really I would say you can make a strong argument that every single one of these is part of something's character. But today we're probably going to be majoring on things like context, which is where a development sits, and where a new place or a part of an existing place is trying to embed itself. And that could be architecture, it can be views, that kind of thing. Identity, so attractive and distinctive. So we'll be talking some more about what the components of identity are and what we mean by things that seem quite abstract, like attractive. Some examples here of some quite distinctive places. And then finally, we've got built form, which is a coherent pattern of development. Again, but this is kind of new language, I think, that maybe moves away from architectural language, but this is a bad example, by the way, so I don't want anyone running away thinking this is good. Coherent patterns of development. This is a picture of Bath, which it is in my view, it is the pattern of development that gives its coherent character. We're going to move on now to our discussion, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Before I do that, I'd like the panelists to go around and introduce themselves. Emily, I'm going to start with you. If you want to say who you are.
I'm an Associate Director at Sistra. and I'm a transport planner and urban designer. I started as an engineer and I sort of got distracted along the way into first transport planning and then urban design. I think that's because I don't see how you can do transport planning without urban design or vice versa. So I've ended up doing that. I'm particularly interested in streets and their complexity and the fact that they're often contended spaces and we don't do them terribly well. How can we do them better? And I'm also really interested just in the role that transport plays in placemaking and the opportunities for placemaking and generating levels of activity that create interest in place. So that's me.
Okay, interesting. Fiona, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm Fiona here and I'm a landscape architect and three-dimensional artist. So I've had over 25 years of experience in public authority and private practice. I work at a strategic level on various documents and guides, and I also do detailed design work. I sit on the design review panel for Design Midlands. I'm particularly interested in integrated design, quality integrated design and placemaking and how everything sort of relates together.
Okay, fantastic. And Joe, finally.
Yeah, I'm Joe Hollyoak. I'm an architect and urban designer. I'm a sole practitioner based in Birmingham. I've spent a lot of my life in education, teaching architecture and urban design. I used to run the graduate urban design course in Birmingham before it closed down.
Oh, wow.
I'm also a conservationist. I do casework for the Victorian Society and the 20th Century Society in the West Midlands. A lot of my professional work has been working in a participatory manner. I've done a lot of work with working with residents on improving badly designed housing estates.
Okay.
There isn't as much money for that as there used to be. And I also write a column for the Birmingham Post, trying to get the importance of good design across to the general public. I don't know whether anyone takes any notice, but I do it.
All right, fantastic. I probably should introduce myself. I'm Gary Hall. I'm an urban designer and one of the contributing editors to Building for Life. I have variously worked on generally kind of large-scale urban developments, urban extensions, that kind of thing. Character is always a key issue on projects of that scale and complexity, due to the fact that they can be kind of many places rolled into one. So I do have a kind of keen interest in this particular issue. I think before we get going into some of the details, I think it's probably worth outlining from the panel. What do you think the current issues are? I mean, what problem are we tackling here? I don't know who wants to lead on that. Go on, AJ.
Yeah, me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that the mega issue is trying to emphasize the importance of good design in the planning process. And I think that's the chief virtue, it seems to me, of this document, that it explains that good design has a high value. And during my professional lifetime, the perceived relevance of design in planning has gone up and down a huge amount. And the low point was probably sometime during the Thatcher years in the 1980s, when it was declared that design is not a material matter in planning.
Yep.
And we've turned that completely around. I think it dipped a bit when CABE was closed down. It's improved a bit since. So to me, that's the biggest lesson, that good design is an important material matter in making planning decisions.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially the kind of the idea of kind of deprioritizing and then reprioritizing depending on where we are in the cycle. Anyone else want to say what they think current issues of practice are?
I think one of the issues is to really value for money, value of good design and actually integrated design and people working together right at the outset. Because I think, what we see where we do have schemes that are good design, it's actually everybody working together with a common vision right at the beginning, you know, so that they're not different, you know, professions are not all struggling to get their own little bit in. And I think that having a really strong vision, saying, well, you know, this is going to be cost effective, we can, you know, make savings by doing this in one field and another field, or the whole approach to design actually gives developers value for money, and let's all, you know, efficiently work together at the beginning. I think that's the big issue, I think, for me.
Okay, Emily, you.
I agree, obviously, with Joe about the fact that it's so important that this document just acknowledges that design is really important for lots and lots of reasons. But we have all been saying that for a long time, you know, throughout most of my professional life. We've actually been talking about the need for good design. And I think the thing that is interesting about this is the acknowledgement that it is cross-cutting, everything's interrelated. Character relates to all the dimensions set out, you know, all the 10 characteristics set out in the document. I think the thing that it doesn't do is talk about process, because which is probably not the purpose of it, but it's something we need to think about quite hard, because delivering good design is actually really, really difficult. Otherwise we would do it a lot more than we do. Yeah. And certainly with housing, we're not consistently delivering really good design. So yes, this is a good start. I think we need to be very, very thoughtful about process and collaboration and skills, as well as having, you know, documents like this which talk about the need for good design.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there is, in my experience, there is a problem with, in terms of, certainly with the term character, in that it's quite easy to default to designers, certainly, and well, probably everyone involved in the process, thinking that's just what something looks like. And it's often, I feel, regarded as something you do at the end, once you've made all the important decisions about kind of money allocation and land use and that kind of thing. And then you're given a kind of brush to go away and kind of tart up what you've got to make it look nice.
Wallpaper, that's what it is.
Yeah, I think the National Design Guide does quite an interesting job, actually, in terms of explaining that the character comes as much from how a place is used and how it functions, and the kind of experiential stuff it gives you, beyond just the aesthetic. And I kind of always think of, so I don't know, Chinatown in London. Its character is not the buildings. The buildings are pretty generic London. It's the way that people occupy the spaces in between. It's the way that people adorn the kind of the shop windows and so on and so forth that gives that place a character that's almost entirely devoid from its physical appearance. I think that's quite a difficult thing to get across in a document like this. And in my experience, it's quite a long way from where we are in terms of thinking about character, personally. We've got a question actually from a participant. There is talk of a national design code to follow on. It's a kind of blank section in the National Design Guide. I don't know what form this is going to take. And I'm very worried when I see the term design code, because to me, code has a very narrow meaning. Does anyone know anything about what this is going to be? And is that something that we can realistically do in this country with its kind of very fine grain differentiation across areas?
Well, I don't know what it's really going to be, and I suppose it's a question of resources. Who, you know, how is that code going to be sort of developed and worked up? Really, I think.
Yeah.
It will be, for me, you know, context, and context is quite important, and how you know, character is personality, really, and again, it's having that vision at the beginning, and it's setting that up, and a lot of things are functional, but I always say, what is the mood going to be of this place? You know, what is the feel, what is the personality trait of this?
Yeah.
You know, that's got to be looked at, and you know, on a sort of detail level for each site. So I'm not quite sure how that would be. It'd be interesting to see what the proposals are for that document, really.
Yeah, Joe, you were going to come in here.
Yes, I'm personally very much in favour of explicit and firm design policies and design codes. Most European countries and North America use these to an extent which is not practiced in this country. We are very reactive in this country. We want to see a proposal and then argue over it rather than pre-setting criteria for what a good design ought to be. Having said that, what worries me is that I think the idea of these firm design codes is probably antithetical to the British character. I suspect, much as I would like to see it, it won't happen because it simply isn't historically the way that we do planning.
That is actually, I think, a very important point, because we are a bit of an anomaly internationally in terms of how we plan. Other nations are far more happy to take a very proactive public role in the design agenda, whereas I get the feeling that we're kind of a reactionary kind of system that sits there and waits for proposals, and then we can, either endorse it or kind of knock chunks out of it. This would be a shift in terms of who does what. Do you think that's a positive step? And is it a positive step? And if so, what do we need to go along with it? So that's quite a big change, actually.
Can I just come
Emily,
back
go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be really useful in terms of streets, because streets are really complicated, and there are lots of different types of street, and we're not always clear about the characteristics that are needed for different types of street. And so I think it could be a really useful framework if it goes into the detail of maybe a linked place approach as a framework, not a set of defined rules, but as a framework to look at, what's required of different street types in development. It's not something we do particularly well at the moment, and it's not something that the design guide that we're talking about goes into probably enough or to any great degree of detail. So I think developing the design code framework could be quite useful to give prompts for those things. Yeah,
I don't know, panel, if you can see the Q&A panel that's popped up on my screen. We've got a few people asking essentially the same question, which is about skills, capacity to do this sort of thing. The shift from processing planning application through development management and some of the preemptive work that's done in policy through to front loading a lot of the design requirements would require, I think, quite a lot of resources and a pretty comprehensive training program. It's a big ask for people. Do we think, number one, there's the appetite for that in terms of both in the profession and in terms of funding from government? I mean, yes, the National Design Guide's a good statement of intent, but you've got to back that up with the support network. And I guess the next question is, are we able to get a characterful places by using this system? I don't know who wants to come in on that. Joe, I think you mentioned a slight concern that it's just not the British way. It's just not the way we get into this.
I'm looking at a question on the screen from Rachel Leggett. She says, can you give us an example of a really good design code produced by a local community, perhaps as part of a native plan? No, I can't. I wish I could, because I think it would be an excellent topic for discussion. Maybe someone else knows. And I'm also looking at Simon Kahn's comment that about the 18th century London Building Acts. They are an exception to what I said. They were, okay, it's 300 years ago, but they were a really good example of a firm design code that's produced some really good neighborhoods, really good streets, and they're still highly valued. So if we could do it in the 1970s, we should still be able to do it today. Yeah,
I mean, I've worked on, luckily or unluckily, worked on quite a few design codes. I don't know if the rest of the panel wants to talk about their experience of working with this type of tool and the impact on character. Emily.
I think it's interesting. I think they can be really, really useful, obviously, for setting out the sort of key components of a development. But I don't think it's the only thing you do. I sort of come back to process and skills a lot, because you need to review at each stage. You know, somebody said setting out a vision, a strong vision right at the beginning, but then the steps of the process, you know, you need to review and test and work collaboratively, you know, to look at whether what's being developed through the planning process and then later what's been delivered is actually what you set out to do. And nothing's perfect, you know, but have things been delivered as well as they could be? So I think it's yes, it's about, and you know, character is part of that. It's difficult to talk about just character in some ways, because this is about the design process as a whole, I suppose. But yeah, I think design codes have a place, this guidance has a place, but also process, the design process and the development of the design process as part of the planning process is critically important as well. And that's true of streets, just as it's true of the rest of the development as well.
Yeah. Oh, we have our first poll result. Should the design code approach be adopted in England? Apparently, the dreaded ratio, 52% have said yes. I can't stand that poll result. Interesting split though. Some people obviously don't think it should. Be interesting to explore that, why 60 people answered. Okay, that's interesting.
I think, sorry, go on.
No, go on, Fiona.
The point of is the design code, you know, it's quite a strong criteria really, and I think, you know, that there is a value to that, and usually there's an investment that's gone into that. You know, if there's a commitment to design code, there's often an investment to do that. But I think, again, going back to the original principle of what is the vision for the development or whatever, and what you're trying to achieve, I think if we're asking questions all the time, but saying, you know, why have you changed that? And if the rationale is, you know, that fits in with the vision and the approach, there needs to be that flexibility. If it's just changed because, well, you know, there's not the viability, or there's not this, that, you know, that's all. So I think it's actually asking the questions, why have you done that? And it's like character, why is that building?
Yeah.
Why is that format the way it is? Why is that tree there? Why is that street there? And if you've got a really clear rationale that fits within the overall approach, then I think that's considered thinking, and it's integrated thinking. But often there isn't really a reason why something may have changed or why something's been put where it wants. And I think that's the key thing, and it's answering these questions that we need to be asking all the time on every development.
Yeah.
Why is that there? How does that give character? If you've got an answer to that, that's something that can be discussed.
Emily, go on, you wanted to come in on that.
I think it's also understanding the sort of almost intangible things that you can add to a development to introduce sort of delight and activity and fun and those sorts of things that we sort of don't often talk about through the planning process. You know, how is this street going to be fun for the people that live, or the kids that live here? And I think, you know, the design codes provide a really good framework, but we also need to introduce those intangibles and encourage sticky streets and places that people want to spend time in, and that huge amount of character. But it's the sort of thing we don't think about often enough, I think, and also learning from existing development as well. Looking at existing places that are wonderful and lovely, you know, how could some of those ideas and some of those little quirky things be introduced into a new development, which often, despite you know, design codes, design review, some of those things often end up quite bland and tedious. Yeah.
I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about the various components of character. And you've all got your specialisms, and it'd be interesting to talk about where you see where you see your particular design specialism fitting in the hierarchy, and where it should fit in the hierarchy. It's also, I think, probably worth spending a couple of minutes talking about where the best value for money can be found for people seeking to improve the character of their developments, because I get a lot, personally get a lot of kind of, well, it's too expensive. We'd love to do something of higher quality and better character, but we just can't afford it. I think that's an idea that needs pushing back against, actually. But I don't know who wants to lead on that. Joe, do you want to go first? We've not heard from you for a while, so drop you in at the deep end. Where can people kind of go in the design world to get character and improve character and identity for their projects? I have a horrible feeling Joe's machine's frozen. Does someone else want to jump in and save me from this silence, quick?
Shall I? I mean,
yeah, go on, Emily, you go first.
I mean, understanding context is obviously critical. I think that's come up on some of the comments that have been made, you know, and really understanding that the place that you're intervening in or near to is really, really important, and the opportunities that arise as a result of the uniqueness of that place and the type of development that you're delivering as well. The movement patterns as well as something that, you know, understanding where you can get little hubs of activity, you know, whether that's around a retail area or a play area or just some sort of fun thing that's on a movement network. You know, those are the sort of things from a movement point of view, certainly can really add character.
Emily, can I chuck one of the audience questions at you here? It's from Graham Smith, and this is specifically about how we're going to. I think this fits with what you're saying. How we're going to get highways departments who hold both quite a lot of decision-making power, but also purse strings in terms of ongoing maintenance. How are we going to get them on board with selling their role in developing places of character?
I mean, that's the debate that's gone on and on and on, isn't it, throughout the whole of my working life. And
yeah, if you could answer it in the next 2 minutes, that'd be great.
So
we can move on to something else.
Well, I think it's not a short answer, is it? I mean, I think things are slowly moving, but I think we've got to get away from this, the headbutting that happens, and somehow embed collaborative, you know, on projects, embed collaborative working, so that, you know, the things that highway authorities are trying to do around safety and function are also things that the planning authorities and you're trying to deliver through planning. The things that the highway authorities aren't often thinking about, we're really interested to hear how it's moving, are the wider about, you know, the attractiveness of streets, delight and all the rest of it. But actually, the public sector as a whole needs to have streets that deliver walking and cycling, and that isn't just about function, that's about it being delightful, sticky, all those other. So there's a lot of things that align. There's a lot of objectives the public sector has, which highway authorities also have because they're part of county councils or unitaries, that need streets to be attractive, pleasant, sticky, as well as really functional and safe. So it's trying to have a design process and a development process that involves collaboration and a shared set of outcomes. I think, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's needed, is those shared outcomes that you try and establish right at the beginning, and then you test all the way through against those.
Okay,
that's the short answer.
Excellent, thank you. Before I hand over to Fiona, what's a sticky street?
What's a sticky street? Gary,
tell everyone.
Honestly, my goodness, that's a gap in knowledge. a street that people want to hang out in.
Yeah.
You know,
okay. I
playing.
Yeah.
Talking. Throw a ball.
I think one of the, and it's actually been raised in the discussion section between the participants, I think one of the interesting opportunities and side effects of the current situation is that a lot more people are spending a lot more time as critical consumers of the public realm, because it's the only form of outside your house entertainment that you have these days, be it the cycle routes in London. Simon's raised the cycle routes, the rapid rate in which new cycle routes are going in, or be it just people discovering new spaces in their neighborhood, getting out on their bikes if they can, or getting out and walking a lot more. I do wonder if we're going to usher in a kind of an era where people are a bit more sensitive and a bit more critical of what's being done with their hard-earned tax money on streets and public realm. On that note, Fiona, what's the role of landscape in all of this? And in terms of character development, generation, and so on, it often feels to me that it's an overlooked resource. What's your view?
I think, I mean, you know, it's hard landscape and soft landscape, really. And I think, you know, landscapes, the external environment and the components that are within it. So I think there's opportunities actually to use, you know, the external landscape actually in quite a cost-effective way. I mean, not just soft landscape, but I mean, for example, we're just talking about, you know, soft landscape. You know, the role of trees and hedges in an external environment. We were just talking about highways engineers. Well, that's, you know, we all know it's a valuable tool for, you know, climate change. But actually often, you know, in some of these large schemes we're looking at, we can spend a lot of time discussing the, you know, the shape of the porches sort of thing in the front doors. And actually, you think if in 20 years' time, if you're walking down that street, and there's an avenue of trees and hedges outside the front, you won't really pick up on, you know, that doorknob sort of thing. So I think there's a value that landscape and soft landscape or boundary treatment in a very efficient way can actually add value for money very, very simply. And we know about how, you know, green spaces improve value, and nobody really, you can't, it's not easy and quite so tangible, but I think, you know, in this document, we can, you know, it helps to say, well, let's look at what are those things doing? You know, we can create very simply by using, you know, I'm just talking about soft landscape now, for example.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Using, you know, a continuity in your street hierarchy, you know, in your trees, you know, in your, you know, hedges or whatever, and actually overlap that continuity with placemaking so that you don't, so you can use that to help navigate. And we sort of know all these things, but actually I think it's, and that's why I always think, you know, having a sort of landscape strategy to say, well, to tie in with your street hierarchy, you know, right at the beginning, if we're looking at highways and street, you know, how can we reinforce what we're trying to do with these streets or places? And actually, it might be that we lose 3 meters of our park, you know, down the road, but actually it would be much more valuable, because quite often we have this sort of, we've got our streets and a few trees, and then we've got all our wildlife here and a play areas here. And I think actually right at the beginning saying, well, actually we may benefit by having smaller specific green spaces, and the spaces that people are walking to and from, or cycling through or stopping at, have a stronger value. So I don't know whether that was the answer to your question. I forgot what the question was now, Gary.
No. I think that was good. So go on, Emily. You wanted to come in again.
I was just going to say, I just think that's absolutely right, and it's you know, designing the whole of the public realm to do, including streets, public spaces, to do the very wide range of things that they need to do, you know, in terms of, you know, all the things that Fiona's talking about, in terms of streets, you know, having those little incidents along the streets where you can stop your micro parts, your pocket parts, the local narrow out, and it introduces interest. It makes walking far more interesting and far more accessible for a much wider range of people, improves legibility, you know. So all of these layers are really, really important. Landscape's obviously a critical part of that.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Emily, I spoke across you. Go on. What did you just say?
I was just wanted to support what Fiona said from a perspective.
Yeah, in my experience, a strong landscape strategy can kind of hide a multitude of architectural sins, and the buildings can kind of play second fiddle to the hard and soft landscape. And I think who mentioned that kind of, you know, if you're relying on, I don't know, design of the windows or the color of the front doors to generate the character of a place, I think you're instantly in quite a weak position, because these are things that cycle quite quickly. People will change them, and I've seen developments where you'll have very strict kind of things like all the windows have to be the same color. And what's the lifespan of a UPVC window? 20 years, something like that. If in the 100-year time frame, this stuff will all be cycled. But if you've got a good landscape strategy with decent specimen trees, you're going to be embedding these buildings in a very green and kind of lush place, and that will be the overarching character.
And I think that can be very simple. It's just identifying the approach. I mean, we often, we're always listening on the radio, oh, we've got to plant all these trees in national forests, and gosh, we haven't got room for them. Well, there's a lot of room on housing developments. We could be planting a lot of those trees as part of our process, and then we wouldn't be saying, well, we've got to find some land to plant them all on. And I think right at the outset, it's like, I suppose, it's just the principles and ensuring that there's space for that, and not being too slavish about, well, how much do we need for this and that. And so like a hierarchy, it's a hierarchy of spaces, and, it could be the size of your trees, or whether you're having hedges, or whether you're having fences, or what you can see, it's
quite often you'll see kind of lollipop fruit trees, and you think, well, you trade 10 of those for one decent kind of specimen tree in a space. I think soft landscape and tree planting in particular seems to be one of the first casualties of adoption and cost cutting, in my view. What can we do against this? Because I feel it's denuding our design teams of one of the places they can go to generate character and identity.
I mean, some highway authorities are changing those. So, I mean, there's the time thing, and I think identifying those authorities that are changing, and then pointing other authorities that aren't towards that. People love trees, and if you try and remove a tree from an established street, you absolutely can't, quite rightly. And so I think it's maybe making that argument to just say the long-term character is really important, just with some individual trees. Commuted sums play a part, without a doubt. I think a lot of authorities are now, highway authorities are now, and again, I'd be interested to hear from people that are dialed in. Happy to have trees as long as the detailing is right. They're not slabs and all the rest of it, and they have commuted sums for maintenance as well. So I think that there aren't so many barriers as there probably were 5 or 10 years ago to trees in streets, particularly now with the climate change agenda and the wide around concerns around health. So again, it's the alignment of these agendas as well, and making the point that trees and streets are part of delivering to those wider agendas. Yeah,
there seems to be a lot of cross-cutting. There's a big cross-cutting role for landscape in general in terms of delivering a lot of the things we expect from good design. Joe, welcome back.
Thank you. I've no idea what happened. I do apologise.
The joys of technology. We have just been spending some time talking about things other than buildings in terms of generating character and identity, majoring on the role of streets and landscape. I would like to talk about buildings. They're obviously very important. Would you like to kind of highlight for everybody some of the areas that you think, in terms of our built form, that we struggle with in terms of generating character, and maybe how some of these, in your experience, some of these problems are overcome?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. In terms of building,
straight in at the deep end.
Yes, yeah. Well, one issue which I've been pondering about since reading the document is the issue of local distinctiveness. And there's a rather conservative view, which is at large, I think, about regional and local distinctiveness. It's to do with materials that buildings are made of and local types and so on. But one thing I'm quite pleased to see in the document is a couple of paragraphs which actually emphasize that often it's a good thing not to be conservative and try to reproduce the existing character of buildings, but to put in something new. Now, I think that can be misread, it can be misinterpreted, it could be used as a license to do something really unsuitable. But we do need to continually do things that are really not necessarily part of the context. I mean, to give an example, quite close to me is one of the most characterful built urban areas, which is Bournville. Now,
sure. Yeah.
when Bournville was built, it was nothing at all to do with its surrounding context. It was an entirely new and novel kind of built form. And yet it's now seen as sort of traditional and contextual and all of that. And I think the lesson is sometimes be brave and do something that is with a distinctive character, but not necessarily what's often called keeping in keeping. A lot of the places we admire don't keep in keeping.
I think one of the points, Joe, about that is that if you have a rationale, you know, and you're looking at form and proportions and greening and all these things work together, you know, you can achieve success, and then people will take on board something. You know, often we see, oh, right, we've got all these buildings here and we're just copying a bit of that and a bit of that and a bit of that. So, you know, and instead of sort of really looking and assessing what you've got and saying, well, we are going to take some of those elements, but it might be scale, it might be proportion, it might not even be material, you know. If there's a really clear, considered approach that works, it can be really successful.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Emily.
It was just the issue about not necessarily being slavish to context. I think you've still got to connect in terms of movement, you know, so I mean, context in terms of movement is really critical to connect into. And I mean, that's one of the failings of lots of new places. They don't connect in very well. Lots of design review panels where we get this sort of isolated patch of development that has done all the context analysis. There's lots of work gone on from an urban design, landscape, biodiversity point of view. It does not connect. You know, it might have 1 or 2 points of access. It's not integrated in that way. Yeah. And I think that's important.
I think, Emily, I do agree with that. If you join places up, you can afford to have a huge amount of difference.
Yes, absolutely.
A huge amount of heterogeneity, to use a difficult word. And it really doesn't matter all that much as long as everything connects.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'm also slightly skeptical of well, I feel that a lot of, in terms of context and its relationship to character, one thing that a lot of design teams don't pick up on is designing within our time. A lot of, in my view, kind of previous developments look the way they do because they are a product of the technologies available, of the materials available, of the priorities around energy use, the way people lived, etc. And we are in a position now where we have some challenges that are relatively unique. Part of it is to do with climate change, and we need to rediscover some of the lessons to do with passive solar gain and orientation, that kind of thing. And quite often I hear design teams will say to me that, well, what we're doing is we're taking a fabric first approach with our building to make them energy efficient, but we're going to make it look like the thing that's down the road. And I feel that's going to fundamentally constrain us on our ability to hit these other targets that we see as a priority, to do with reducing the need to travel, reducing the amount of energy and embedded energy in our buildings, and so on. These buildings should look different, and these places should look different, in my view. They should function in an integrated way. But I think if we've got a kind of neo-vernacular appearance at the end of it, we can't be being responsive both to our context and to our time. Joe, sorry.
Yeah, and one of the big issues there, Gary, I think, is factory-made houses. We're going to be it's inevitable. We're going to be getting a lot more mass-produced, prefabricated, factory-made houses. And how do we square that fact with the issue of distinctive character? I think we can. And I think the great precedent for this, again, I've mentioned this before, is Georgian house building. The Georgian houses that were built in the late 18th century were almost, in many cases, identical products. And yet they've remained highly valued places to live. And I'm sure we can do exactly the same with well-designed factory-made houses. Whether they're the ones that Urban Splash are making or whether we need something better, we can discuss, but it's going to happen.
Sorry,
I've got both of you. I want to give both of you. Fiona, you come in next.
I think we've been talking about, sort of physical context, but I think we also have to recognise, we have mentioned slightly historical context, but you look at Saltaire and look at these places. They were built by organisations or for workers or whatever, and I think it's about what is the, who are you building for, and what is the framework. Apple, the Apple building in California is very different, and that's built based on their vision, and whether you agree with it or disagree with it. And I think context and identity are really important, because you're looking at, what is the context? Is that emotional? Is it physical? Is it historical? Is it, moving towards the future? Is it? So I think, you can actually create really distinctive places, but if they've got an identity, and then with that, you can link how you get through to them, what the gateways, what the overlap, whether you use, the streets to provide continuity, and that could be materials, it could be planting, it could be curtilages. So I think it's how you bring something different and link it and overlap it in a sort of manner that has a rationale and a reason. And if you have got houses that are all being built, it's how you put them together. Do you have a mews? Do you have a terraced houses? And what are we've seen quite good examples. So I just wanted to say, I do think context, in its really broadest sense, it isn't just about what's in keeping. I think somebody mentioned it's about.
Someone's made that point in the chat.
I think it's broader than that. It's much broader than that. It's not just what's around it. We've got to look like those places. Sorry, Emily.
Emily, you come in, and then Joe, I'll let you come in on that as well.
Two really quick points. It was just picking up on what Joe was saying about Georgian. I'm sitting in a Georgian house, and I'm in a terrace.
No one likes to show off.
But it's not an original Adam fireplace. I'll just stress that was stripped out by somebody years ago, so we haven't got one of those. But it's a terrace. It's just a straightforward house, actually, but the proportions are good. But the thing that makes the area is the streets and the public realm and the simplicity of the detailing and proportions of the house. So we have a front garden that you can sit in just about and talk to your neighbours. There is very good street trees, as Fiona, not continually down. It's not a formal structure. It's just there is very, very good landscaping, and it's very well connected. And parking sort of works, even though there is no much free. And I think you can have some very ordinary housing if it's well detailed and consistent and has good spaces internally, and but you really need good streets, good public realm, good landscaping, really good connections and access to local services as well, all of which is often for some developments quite difficult. And just a final comment on character, I think one of the things that's really interesting that we don't talk about enough is levels of activity, which relates to movement networks, and different streets have completely different characters. And again, where I'm sitting, I have a quiet street at the front and then a very busy street along the main road. Those are completely different characters because of the levels of activity, not because of the buildings. And I think we need to think about those things and those opportunities as well. So character is also about just general levels of activity and the opportunities, the connections that you're building in, or not in a lot of cases, but hopefully in lots of cases, give you develop levels of activity. Sorry.
That's okay. I think, as Joe said earlier, the Georgian example gives you a lot of support for the idea that, number one, you can just repeat something over and over and still get a strong sense of character and identity. And one of the things I always take away from the Georgian approach is that there's a lot of simplicity there.
Yeah.
And I think there is a view within many design circles that as long as you layer on a shed load of complexity and twiddly bits, you'll end up with something characterful. And in my experience, when I look at places that have done that, they actually come away feeling a bit like they could be anywhere. You know, there's nothing you can pick up on in terms of patterns. Joe, go on, you come in on that now.
Yeah, there's a political dimension here as well, Gary, which I'd like to mention, which I think that the production of neighbourhoods with character is a bit difficult to square with the idea of a modern participatory democracy. Because if we look back into history at many of the neighbourhoods which we agree have character, the West London Georgian estates, for example, were determined by big landowners. They were the ones in control. Bournville, which I've mentioned, another place with really distinctive character, was run by George Cadbury. He was the autocrat, the industrial autocrat who made all the decisions. He's the guy that produced the harmony and the consistent character that Bournville has that people value. And maybe that kind of pattern is not universal, but it's pretty common, I think, that character has come from a central degree of control.
No, I think that's correct. Sorry, Emily, do you want to come in on that?
I was just going to sort of build on that a little bit, because I think design codes can fulfill that role in part. And I think what's interesting, just actually around where I live, is that they had like a little code. It was built by lots of people, and there are sort of variations, but there was a rule that you had to have a certain setback. There was a rule that you had to have a certain set of proportions, and there was a rule that you had to have the front of the building rendered. And so, although lots of different people built, and there was an original one landowner who sold different parcels of, the code, if you like, was the thing that has delivered that consistency and that really strong and lovely character. So I think we're back to the question right at the beginning about the possible role of codes and briefs, looking at Penny Stevens' possibility look at individual.
Right, panel, we have 5 minutes left. Sorry, Fiona. I want to try and get to some of the Q&As and comments that we've seen. We've done a pretty good job, I think, of ignoring the polls that they've come through. So thanks for everyone who's participated with those. I'm going to start going to go to the top about, I think, Penny, we've answered your question about, have we answered the question about the branching out about house types? And I feel that we've said that standard house types aren't a problem if applied correctly, because of the Georgian example, which is effectively standard house types. How do we get house builders to move away from trying to deliver a series of homes and into delivering a place? If you could answer that in 1 minute or less, panel, someone needs to jump in on that. Is that a political thing, Joe? Going back to your political point.
Well, yeah, it's always political. I mean, the easy answer is really to demand a degree of intelligence from the developer. We do have good developers who respond to the kind of criterion you're talking about. Argent, I would nominate. Urban Splash, big developers who do pay attention to the wider picture, not just narrow economics. They know about placemaking, and they know about diversity and so on. How we fix that other developers should be as good as they are, I have no idea at all.
Okay, I'm looking at some of the other questions here. Simon, should future-proof be banned from design statements?
Yes. There's no such thing. There's no such, because we don't know, as we have learned really a lot in the last sort of 3 months, we don't know what the future holds. I think, we can be intelligent about design and think about resilience and think about all the different possibilities for things. You know, there are lots of ways of looking at that, but I think future-proof should definitely be banned. I agree, Simon.
There you go. It's gone.
I think flexibility is a positive word. You know, we look at the historical buildings that have been converted. If you're building a block, you know, that for 1 bedroom, you know, students, and then suddenly there's no students, you know, but if you've got flexibility, you know, that's a different approach,
I'd agree with that.
That would change or could change or.
Okay, we've got a question here from David. Why do you think that a lot of development plans, neighbourhood development plans, have shied away from adopting policies on design? And I guess there's a kind of supplementary one to that: is are design policies in general strong enough? Who wants to tackle that? None of you. Good. I think neighbourhood. I've worked on a lot of neighbourhood plans, and I find that neighbourhood planning groups are very keen to talk about design. It's quite difficult to then distill that using the resources they've got into something useful that is going to inform new design in their area. They know the places they live in very, very well. Experientially, it's quite difficult for groups to express that in policy terms, just as it's quite difficult. Sorry, go on, Joe, go on.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, we do have sufficient clout in our planning policies and regulations to ensure that bad design doesn't happen. I would mention the recent national housing audit. I can't remember the exact figures, but the authors of the housing audit reckon that a big proportion, I think it was at least a quarter, of all recent housing developments should have been refused permission.
Yeah, it was something horrific. Yeah,
there were the grounds there on design quality to refuse them, but they weren't.
I think that's a really big issue, and I think, you know, Paul Watson raised it about abiding, you know, and enforcing policy. There's a fear that, oh, we can't enforce it because, oh, you know, we're holding up the whole process and it's all our fault. And I think until people sort of say, look, we are enforcing this, you know, things will just continue. It's like breaking the law, isn't it? People will do it unless we have raves, unless they're not allowed to. You know.
Right.
Just
go on, Emily, last comment, because we've got to go, unfortunately.
Last comment is that I still think that although that a lot of the sites that we're developing, you can't make truly accessible from a walking, cycling, public transport. So I mean, in the case of location and densities, we're still, you know, the idea that we're promoting sustainable transport, we've got to be more realistic about that, you know, but that's partly our planning system where, you know, sites are put forward through the sort of allocations process. So I think, you know, in terms of really promoting walking and cycling, 15-minute towns and cities, you know, we need to be a lot more, we need to have a lot better understanding of what makes places sustainable from a transport and movement point of view. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. Right, I'm going to bring this, I think we could talk all afternoon, and I think maybe even longer if we just cracked open the gin. I'm not encouraging that, by the way, I just want to say. I want to show everybody the timeline for the rest of the program that we're running. So I'm going to put that up on the screen. I do hope everybody who's participated today wants to join us for the remaining 3 sessions. Okay, so that's that. And then finally, I'd like to say thank you to our panel for attending, making this a lively discussion. It's been great fun. Thank you. And to our attendees, thank you everybody who's joined in. Your discussions have all been recorded. This video will be available online. And thank you very much. I'm really enjoying these sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.